In the heart of the Sahel, a powerful moment unfolded, a moment that would shake not just the African continent, but the world. The Ibrahim Traoré moment was not just a political maneuver. It was a direct challenge to the corrupt systems that have plagued the people of Africa and beyond. When Ibrahim Traoré spoke, he didn't just speak for himself. He spoke for every nation shackled by political elites who have long put their own interests above the needs of the people. But as the dust settled, one question remained. How would the world respond? The Ibrahim Traoré reaction reverberated across the globe, striking a chord in places where democracy is often manipulated and power is hoarded by a few. This wasn't just an African issue. It was a global one. From the streets of the Sahel to the halls of power in Western capitals, the reaction to this moment would set the stage for a new era of political reckoning. Before we dive deep into the shocking truth behind the Ibrahim Traoré moment, make sure you subscribe to stay updated on this unfolding story and to get exclusive insights on global reactions that are shaping the future of democracy. The fight for accountability starts now, don't miss it. The stage was set. In a world where political leaders often turn a blind eye to the suffering of their people, the actions of Ibrahim Traoré would be a defining moment in history. It wasn't just another political speech. No, what happened in that moment transcended typical political rhetoric. It was a stark, unapologetic confrontation with the systems of corruption that have long shackled the people of Africa, and by extension, the world. The Ibrahim Traoré moment wasn't merely about his words. It was about the very essence of what it means to hold power and use it with integrity. As Traoré stood before the people of his nation, he didn't just speak. He challenged the political elite, exposing the rot that lies beneath the surface of so many democratic systems. This was no empty condemnation. This was a call for real, tangible change, something deeper than the usual promises we hear from politicians who continue to perpetuate a cycle of greed and neglect. What made this moment so powerful was its universality. It wasn't just about one nation. It was about every country where democracy has become little more than a performance. Every country where the voice of the people is drowned out by the clamor of corruption and manipulation. When Ibrahim Traoré spoke, he didn't just point fingers, he made it clear that he understood the struggles of the everyday person. He knew the plight of the farmer who wakes up before dawn to work the land, only to see the fruits of their labor siphoned away by politicians who never walk a day in their shoes. He understood the teacher who continues to educate with inadequate resources, the nurse who provides care without the tools she needs, and the youth who, despite their dreams, find themselves trapped in a system that offers them no real opportunities. It was in that moment that the weight of his words hit home. In a political landscape often filled with vague promises and empty rhetoric, Ibrahim Traoré's moment was different. His speech didn't just criticize the system, it exposed it. He called out the systematic corruption that runs through every level of government, the lack of accountability, and the complete erosion of trust between the leaders and the people they claim to serve. What Traoré did that day was more than just speaking truth to power. He revealed the brutal truth of what happens when power is no longer held accountable. He painted a picture of a nation where elections are not a true expression of the people's will, but a spectacle, a charade designed to give the illusion of democracy while keeping the power firmly in the hands of a select few. This is the moment when the people, not just of Africa, but of every nation grappling with political manipulation, started to see a leader who wasn't afraid to speak the unspeakable. In that moment, as the world watched, the question became clear. What happens when the truth is spoken and the world takes notice? What happens when a leader like Ibrahim Traoré rises, not to take power for himself, but to demand that the political system be held accountable? This was the crossroads. A crossroads where the political elite in many nations had the choice to either listen to the voice of the people or continue down the dangerous path of corruption. The Ibrahim Traoré reaction reverberated beyond the boundaries of his own nation. It became a rallying cry for others who had long felt the suffocating grip of political elites who placed their interests above those of the people. This wasn't just an African issue, it was a global one. A global crisis where political leaders and systems that once represented the will of the people had become nothing more than tools for the powerful to maintain their dominance. As Traoré spoke, his words echoed the frustrations of the common people who have been ignored for far too long. His speech laid bare the inconvenient truths that many would rather not face. He spoke of a nation whose leadership had become a self-serving system, more interested in preserving its own wealth and power than ensuring the prosperity of the people it was supposed to serve. And so, as the world watched this pivotal moment unfold, it raised a crucial question. Would the people of the nation rise up and take the future into their own hands? Or would they remain silent and allow this system of manipulation and corruption to continue unchecked? This is the challenge that Ibrahim Traoré put before the world, before Africa, before the Caribbean, and before every nation where power has been stripped from the hands of the people. He didn't just make a statement, he sparked a movement. The Ibrahim Traoré moment was a moment that demanded a reaction, a call for justice that could not be ignored. And the world, much like the people of Jamaica, was left to grapple with the consequences of what happens when the truth is laid bare for all to see. The Ibrahim Traoré reaction was not simply a response to one man's speech. It was a collective acknowledgement of the truth that had been ignored for far too long. When the world witnessed the courage with which Traoré stood, speaking out against a system so deeply entrenched in corruption, the response was inevitable. It wasn't just a question of whether the people would rise up, but of what kind of ripple effect would unfold across borders. In the immediate aftermath, reactions flooded in from all corners of the globe. From Africa to the Americas, Traoré's words had ignited a fire in those who had long been suffering under the weight of similar political manipulations. His speech became a rallying cry for anyone who had felt the sting of corruption, the pain of being ignored by their own government. People everywhere began asking themselves, if Ibrahim Traoré could stand against such a system, why couldn't we? Yet the response wasn't all in favor of the bold confrontation that Traoré had initiated. Political elites, both locally and internationally, scrambled to downplay the implications of his speech. In Jamaica, for example, political leaders who should have been listening were busy attempting to discredit the message, choosing instead to ignore the uncomfortable truth that Traoré had unveiled. They saw the reaction not as an invitation to reform, but as a challenge to their control, a threat to the status quo that they had worked so hard to preserve. But the world could not ignore the message. The Ibrahim Traoré moment had struck at the heart of a global issue. Corruption isn't just a problem in Africa. It exists wherever power is hoarded and the people are excluded from the decision-making process. And so, the international community had no choice but to react. Some were quick to voice their support for Traoré, praising his courage in speaking truth to power. Others, however, chose to deflect, fearing the widespread exposure of their own involvement in systems of exploitation. In the U.S., for example, There was a muted but noticeable reaction from some political observers and diplomats. They were aware that this was not an isolated issue. This was a warning sign that political systems around the world were beginning to break down. This moment wasn't just about Africa or the Caribbean. It was a wake-up call for every democracy that had begun to teeter on the edge of corruption. The Ibrahim Traoré reaction was a call for reform that resonated not just in the halls of power, but also in the streets where ordinary citizens demanded their voices be heard. As the shockwaves of Traoré's speech reverberated across the world, the political elites in many nations found themselves under increasing pressure. Citizens who had been quietly accepting the slow erosion of their democracies now had a voice to rally behind. People were beginning to recognize the power they still held, if only they would unite and demand change. However, Traoré's speech did more than just spark global outrage. It also revealed the flaws within the systems that allowed corruption to flourish. The lack of accountability, the weakening of democratic institutions, and the erosion of public trust were all symptoms of a deeper illness. The political response to Traoré's words from both the corrupt leaders and the international community showed just how entrenched the status quo really was. They didn't want to deal with the truth. They didn't want to face the idea that they might be complicit in the very systems that oppressed the people they claimed to serve. The people of Jamaica, as well as those in other nations facing similar struggles, watched closely. They felt the sting of injustice, the weight of broken promises, and the frustration of a government that had turned its back on its citizens. As Traoré spoke, they knew that the reaction to his words was not just about the political elite's discomfort, it was about their own future and the future of their children. And yet, the deeper question remained: would this reaction lead to real change, or would the elites continue to manipulate the system for their own benefit? In many ways, the Ibrahim Traoré reaction was both a turning point and a tipping point. It marked the beginning of a larger conversation, a conversation that could no longer be ignored or dismissed. But for that conversation to lead to change, the people had to act. They had to stop being passive spectators in their own futures. The political response to Traoré's speech and the global reaction to it revealed a crucial truth. Power, once abused, cannot be easily regained. Leaders who have grown accustomed to their influence, to the privileges that come with power, will resist any challenge that threatens their position. But Traoré's moment was a reminder that no leader, no matter how entrenched in the system, can truly remain untouchable if the people stand together. As the dust settled, one thing became clear. The Ibrahim Traoré reaction was not just about exposing the political elite's manipulation. It was about giving voice to the voiceless and reminding the world that true democracy is built on trust, accountability, and the willingness to hold those in power to the highest standards of integrity. The Ibrahim Traoré reaction ignited a fire, but the consequences of that moment would unfold in the days, months, and years to come. In the wake of his speech, the question on everyone's mind was, what comes next? What happens when a system as deeply ingrained as the one Traoré exposed is forced to confront its corruption? For the political elite, the consequences were immediate. They could no longer ignore the truth that had been laid bare. Traoré's speech had stripped away the facade, revealing the rotting foundation on which their power was built. But for the people of Jamaica and other nations facing similar crises, the consequences were both a heavy burden and a glimmer of hope. At first, many politicians responded as expected. They rallied to protect the status quo, deflecting responsibility and downplaying the significance of Traoré's words. They attempted to shift the narrative, calling his speech divisive and inflammatory. But the more they spoke, the more they exposed their own complicity in the systems of oppression and corruption that had long gone unchecked. The Ibrahim Traoré reaction had pulled back the curtain, and the world could now see how deeply corruption had taken root. No longer could the elites pretend that the problem was isolated or insignificant. For the citizens of Jamaica, the consequences were both personal and political. The speech had reignited a long-dormant sense of civic duty. People who had once been disengaged or disillusioned by the political system began to see themselves in the fight for justice. But while the Ibrahim Traoré reaction had inspired many to take action, it also highlighted the harsh reality that the road to true democracy and accountability would not be easy. The consequences of allowing corruption to persist for so long were now fully visible. A fractured society, a broken political system, and a profound erosion of trust. The most significant consequence, however, was the impact on public trust. Trust, once broken, is incredibly difficult to rebuild. The people of Jamaica had already been betrayed by a system that promised much but delivered little. They had witnessed the misuse of public funds, the neglect of their basic needs, and the continued enrichment of a political elite that was supposed to represent them. After Ibrahim Traoré's moment, the cracks in the political system were impossible to ignore. As Traoré's words rang in their ears, citizens began to see the scale of the betrayal they had endured. But the erosion of trust was not limited to the government. It had spread throughout every corner of society. The media, once a vital check on power, had become complicit in the silence surrounding corruption. Journalists who dared to expose the truth were silenced or harassed. Civil society organizations, which should have been the loudest voices in defense of democracy, had been co-opted, their influence diluted by the very forces they were meant to challenge. For many, the Ibrahim Traoré reaction represented the breaking of a Dhamma moment when the floodgates of truth opened, and the consequences of years of unchecked corruption came rushing forward. Yet, the aftermath wasn't all despair. The Ibrahim Traoré reaction also set in motion a powerful process of reckoning. People who had once felt powerless began to find their voices. The youth, in particular, were galvanized by the speech. They were no longer content to stand on the sidelines and watch as their future was shaped by a corrupt political class. The consequences of this realization were profound. Across Jamaica, grassroots movements began to rise, challenging the established power structures and demanding a government that would truly serve the people. For the political elite, the consequences were clear. They could either adapt to the changing landscape or risk losing everything. The complacency they had long enjoyed was no longer an option. The very fabric of their power was being unraveled, and they knew it. But in their desperation to maintain control, they turned to old tactics. Voter intimidation, media manipulation, and the diversion of resources into secretive channels became their response to the growing unrest. The Ibrahim Traoré reaction, though powerful, had only exposed the tip of the iceberg. Now, the people would have to contend with the full scope of corruption. The international community, too, faced consequences. The world had watched as Ibrahim Traoré confronted the political class of his nation. But the Ibrahim Traoré reaction wasn't just an African problem, it was a global one. The political manipulation Traoré described was not confined to any one nation or region. It was a disease that spread across borders, affecting democratic institutions everywhere. The international response to Traoré's moment would have to evolve. Governments and organizations that had once turned a blind eye to the plight of the people could no longer justify their silence. The consequences of ignoring corruption in one nation now affected the stability of global systems. The consequences were felt not only by those in power, but by every citizen who believed in the promise of democracy. The speech by Ibrahim Traoré had forced a reckoning, but the real challenge lay ahead. Could the people of Jamaica and the world stand together to demand a new kind of politics? A politics based on truth, accountability, and justice? Or would the elites manage to weather the storm, reinforcing their grip on power once again? As the months passed, the consequences of the Ibrahim Traoré reaction would continue to unfold. The battle for democracy, for the soul of a nation, would not be won overnight. But the first step had been taken. The people had heard the truth, and they could no longer unhear it. The road to reform would be long and difficult, but it had been paved by the courage of one man who dared to speak truth to power. The Ibrahim Traoré reaction did not remain confined to the streets of Africa or the political chambers of Jamaica. It sent shockwaves through the international community. As the speech echoed across the globe, it became evident that this moment was not an isolated cry for justice, but a call that resonated with millions of people struggling against corruption and authoritarianism in every corner of the world. In the United States, the reaction to Traoré's speech was mixed. While many citizens who have long fought for transparency in government saw it as a reminder of their own battles against systemic corruption, political leaders took a more cautious approach. The Ibrahim Traoré moment mirrored struggles that were, in some ways, familiar to the American electorate: the battles for campaign finance reform, the fight against gerrymandering, and the ongoing struggles to safeguard elections from corporate influence. The truth that Traoré exposed was universal. In democracies around the world, the systems that were meant to serve the people often became tools for the powerful few. In the U.S., this moment reignited conversations about the integrity of the political process and the need for reform to restore the true meaning of democracy. However, the reaction in the U.S. government was largely muted, with few leaders directly confronting the implications of Traoré's words. This reluctance to engage was telling many. Politicians, especially those who benefited from the current political system, were unwilling to fully acknowledge the parallels between their own practices and the corruption Traoré described. The Ibrahim Traoré reaction held up a mirror to the world's democracies, revealing uncomfortable truths about the capture of power and the erosion of accountability. Across Europe, the global perspective was similarly divided. Some European leaders praised the courage of Traoré, recognizing that the issues he raised about corruption, the manipulation of the electorate, and the breakdown of democratic institutions were not confined to the global South. From Italy's political scandals to the rise of authoritarianism in Hungary and Poland, the realities Traoré spoke of were all too familiar in Europe. The EU, as an institution, began to reflect on its own failings. Despite its commitment to democracy and human rights, it too had witnessed the rise of populist movements that capitalized on the disillusionment of citizens, often by exploiting the very system of democracy they claimed to champion. Yet, there was also hesitation. As much as some European governments acknowledged the universal relevance of the Ibrahim Traoré reaction, they were also reluctant to face their own shortcomings. The complexities of geopolitics, trade, and diplomacy often caused them to prioritize stability over reform. Many European nations found themselves caught between the desire to publicly support movements for democracy and their own interests in maintaining favorable relations with governments that, while corrupt, were critical to their global influence. In Africa, however, the impact of Traore's speech was profound. His words resonated deeply with citizens across the continent who had long witnessed political elites enrich themselves while the masses continued to struggle. From Zimbabwe to Nigeria, from South Africa to Sudan, the patterns Traore highlighted were all too familiar. The Ibrahim Traoré reaction galvanized movements already fighting against entrenched political systems, breathing new life into calls for reforms, accountability, and justice. What had been a distant dream for many became a tangible possibility. People were now emboldened to challenge the corrupt political systems that had long ruled over them. At the United Nations, discussions began to take on new urgency. If Traore's speech had proven anything, it was that corruption was not confined to any one region. It was a global issue that transcended borders, affecting people in every nation. The Ibrahim Traoré reaction reminded the international community that true democracy could not be a luxury for a few, it was a right for all. As the conversation shifted toward global accountability, the UN began to explore how it could better support nations in their fight against corruption, offering tools and frameworks for transparent governance. But even as international responses began to take shape, one fundamental question remained. Would global institutions, whose own integrity was often called into question, take meaningful action? Would the words of one African leader spark the kind of global transformation necessary to challenge the power structures that had long ruled both the global South and the global North? Or would the Ibrahim Traoré reaction become just another moment in history, another call for justice that went unheeded? The world was watching. And in the wake of this pivotal moment, one thing was certain. The future of democracy, not just in Africa, but across the globe, would depend on whether leaders were willing to confront the uncomfortable truths that Traoré had so bravely laid bare. The Ibrahim Traoré reaction had set the stage for a conversation that could no longer be ignored. It was up to the world to decide whether it would act on this moment of truth or let it slip quietly into history. As the dust settles from the Ibrahim Traoré reaction, the world stands at a critical juncture. The questions now are not just about the past, about the corruption and manipulation that have shaped political systems, but about the future. What comes next? How can nations like Jamaica, and indeed nations across the globe, move beyond the shadows of corruption and reclaim the promise of democracy? The Ibrahim Traoré reaction has sparked a conversation that cannot be ignored, but conversation alone is not enough. Action must follow. For the people of Jamaica, the path forward begins with acknowledging the scale of the problem. This is not a matter of isolated incidents or occasional missteps by politicians. This is a systemic issue that runs deep. Corruption is not just a few bad actors, it's a framework that has been carefully constructed and maintained over time. To move forward, the people must recognize that the solution will not come overnight, but it must begin with a commitment to transparency, accountability, and justice. The first step on this path is strengthening democratic institutions. Political parties must stop treating elections as a game of power and prestige and start seeing them for what they truly are, a fundamental right of the people. Ibrahim Traoré's moment should serve as a wake-up call to political leaders everywhere. Leadership is not about personal gain, it's about service. It's about putting the needs of the people above the desires of the few. In Jamaica, this means real electoral reform, transparency in campaign financing, and a focus on the needs of everyday citizens rather than political elites. No longer can elections be bought, manipulated, or decided behind closed doors. The path forward requires a renewed commitment to the integrity of the electoral process. But political reform is just the beginning. The Ibrahim Traoré reaction also highlighted the urgent need for stronger checks and balances. Institutions that are meant to hold the government accountable, such as the judiciary, civil society organizations, and the media, must be fortified. These institutions cannot be co-opted or silenced by those in power. In fact, the media must reclaim its role as a watchdog, not a mouthpiece for the powerful. Ibrahim Traoré's call for accountability must be echoed by journalists, activists, and ordinary citizens who refuse to let the corruption of the political elite go unchecked. The path forward requires a robust, free, and independent press that can investigate, expose, and challenge corruption at all levels. Perhaps the most important step on the road to reform is the reclamation of the people's voice. The Ibrahim Traoré reaction has made one thing abundantly clear: the power belongs to the people. The youth, in particular, must be at the forefront of this change. They are the ones who will inherit the systems that are currently failing, and they are the ones who have the most to gain from a reformed political system. The Ibrahim Traoré moment should inspire them to take action, to demand the leadership they deserve, and to refuse to accept a future shaped by corruption. This is a call to the youth of Jamaica, Africa, and the world. Rise up and claim your future. But action is not just about protest or resistance. It is also about participation. The path forward requires active engagement from every citizen. Voting is not just a right, it is a responsibility. And it is not enough to simply vote in the next election. Citizens must be engaged throughout the political process, demanding accountability from elected officials, staying informed about the issues that matter, and holding politicians accountable between elections. The Ibrahim Traoré reaction should be a catalyst for a broader civic movement, one that transcends elections and remains active, vigilant, and engaged in shaping the future of democracy. Finally, the path forward requires the international community to step up. The Ibrahim Traoré moment was not just a domestic issue, it is a global one. As nations like Jamaica, across Africa and beyond, fight for true democracy, they need the support of the global community. The fight against corruption cannot be won in isolation. The international community must do more than simply watch from the sidelines. It must actively support nations in their quest for transparency, good governance, and the protection of human rights. This means providing the tools, resources, and pressure needed to hold corrupt regimes accountable. The world is watching, and the message is clear. The Ibrahim Traoré reaction is not the end of the story, it is the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter where the people are in charge, where accountability and justice are not just words, but principles that govern every aspect of political life. The path forward will not be easy, and it will not be quick. But it begins with one simple truth. Change starts when people decide they have had enough. The future of democracy, both in Jamaica and across the globe, depends on whether citizens are willing to stand up, demand accountability, and fight for the future they deserve. As we reflect on the Ibrahim Traoré reaction, it becomes clear that this moment is not just a turning point for Jamaica or Africa, it is a turning point for the world. The issues Traoré raised are universal, transcending borders and reaching into the heart of every democracy. His words have ignited a flame of hope in those who have long been oppressed by corrupt systems. But this is only the beginning. The future of nations like Jamaica, and indeed the future of global democracy, will depend on whether the people choose to act on this moment, or let it fade into history. The Ibrahim Traoré moment revealed the dark truth of political corruption. It showed us how far the rot has spread and how much work is needed to rebuild the foundations of democracy. But it also gave us something precious: clarity. Clarity on the true nature of the challenges we face, and clarity on the steps we must take to overcome them. For Jamaica, for Africa, for the world, reform is not a choice. It is a necessity. The road ahead will be difficult. It will require us to confront uncomfortable truths and challenge powerful systems that have long been entrenched. But as Ibrahim Traoré's moment has shown us, change is possible when the people stand together. The power to shape the future lies in the hands of the citizens, the youth, the workers, the educators, and the ordinary men and women who refuse to be silenced. This is a moment of collective responsibility. The people of Jamaica and the world must rise up and reclaim their democracy, their voice, and their future. What can we learn from the Ibrahim Traoré reaction? It is simple. No government, no leader, no elite is untouchable when the people are united in their demand for change. The fight for justice is not a fleeting moment. It is a lifelong struggle. But with every step forward, with every voice raised in protest and in support of transparency and accountability, we move closer to the democracy we deserve. So I ask you, the viewer, what will you do in the face of this truth? Will you remain silent? Or will you stand up and demand the leadership you deserve? Will you accept a future shaped by corruption? Or will you fight for one shaped by integrity and justice? The time to act is now. Remember, Ibrahim Traoré's moment is not just his moment, it is ours. The future belongs to those who demand better, and the path forward begins with each of us taking the first step toward change. Together, we can rewrite the story of democracy. Together, we can reclaim the future. Subscribe to stay engaged with this ongoing movement. Let your voice be heard in the comments below. How can we, as a global community, move forward together? The future of democracy depends on you.